It is now my honor and privilege to welcome Dr. John N. Gardner back to our lovely campus. Dr. Gardner is a national leader on student success, an individual who has dedicated his career to advancing excellence in undergraduate education. I've had the privilege to know him and worked with him along with 30 chief academic officers a few years ago on a digital learning initiative funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and sponsored by the National Association of Chief Academic Officers to improve student learning, retention, and graduation. Subsequently, we continued that work as part of a regional summit on digital learning for 30 historically Black colleges and universities in the Southeastern United States. Dr. Gardner is no stranger to our campus. He's been here twice before and the population we serve. He worked with faculty and staff during his visit on a number of innovative changes related to the curriculum. For more than 2 decades, he has played a key role in driving the national agenda to improve educational outcomes for all students, especially students from underrepresented populations. As President Delgado noted in his remarks, our focus for the next few years is not only to build on the progress we have made with our freshman population, but also to strengthen the pillars of support for transfer students who comprise a majority of our student population. Dr. Gardner's keynote remarks at today's summit will focus on this population and additional strategies based on lessons from the national landscape that might inform the work we're doing at our own college. The Gardner Institute for Excellence in Undergraduate Education, which he founded with his wife, Betsy O. Barefoot 22 years ago this month, works with colleges and universities to strengthen their resolve and processes to undertake assessment and other improvement actions to increase student learning, retention, and completion. The Institute focuses its work on the use of a set of aspirational standards for improvement of the first year, the transfer student experience, and the gateway course experiences of students at all undergraduate levels. In addition, the Institute offers several additional processes for improving student learning, student retention, and completion. John began his career as an assistant professor, rising through the ranks to full tenured professor before retiring to serve as distinguished professor emeritus of library and information science at the University of South Carolina. He is founding director and senior fellow of the National Resource Center for the First Year Experience and Students in Transition. He is also the recipient of numerous local and national professional awards, including the University of South Carolina's highest award for teaching excellence and the Division of Student Affairs Faculty Award for outstanding contributions to student transitions. He is also the recipient of 12 honorary doctorate degrees from several colleges and universities in the nation, recognizing him for his contributions to American higher education. He has authored and co-authored numerous articles and books and served on advisory boards for the American Council on Education, the Association of American Colleges and Universities, the New York Times, and the Lumina Foundation for Education, among others. His work has been featured in the Chronicle of Higher Education, the New York Times, the Times of London, US News and World Report, Money Magazine, and numerous other publications. We are delighted to have him back on our campus. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gardner to the podium.
Thank you very much, Provost Novasu, for my most recent introduction at Lehman College. Those remarks were an example of how you do your homework. I respect you, and I'm glad to still be living to hear that introduction. I also would like to thank all those that have helped me get ready for this visit. it took a fairly large cast to do that. I want to especially thank Allison Ibrahim, Olina Zadko, who's going to help manage the chat. We're going to request you to enter a number of observations and responses in the chat. And I have another person who's my life support person here, a gentleman by the name of McGill, who will help me get the polling questions in this PowerPoint. Okay, I'm going to have to make an immediate adjustment on that. Okay, how are we doing? I need to take my mask off, don't I? Yeah, okay, thank you. I come from a part of the country where it's so different from New York City in so many respects, but the public buses do not have signs, electronic signs saying mask required. College campuses are prohibited from the appropriate safety measures that you all have. You're so lucky to live in a state like this that is so cognizant of what it takes for all of us to be responsible. I know we have other colleagues from the BTAG Alliance that are with us, and of course, especially from the Lehman College, and I've heard often use the word family to describe you. I love that, the metaphor, and I'm honored that your president of 92 days is here to welcome you and hear some of what I have to say. I'm already wondering what he's going to say in 457 days, which will be the 92 plus 365, according to my math. And Mr. President, I hope you'll get somebody in your office to forward to me a copy of your remarks a year from now, okay? Because I'm sure the provost is going to continue this. So ladies and gentlemen, I'm the warm-up act for the people that matter the most today. And those are your colleagues that are going to be talking to you about a number of initiatives that for which there is still room for more of you to get involved. So it's kind of a pitch, but we want you to better understand these and help the leaders of these evaluate them so that they can be further strengthened. Now, I want to recall, it's easy for me to do, yesterday morning, I flew over New York City about 8:30 in the morning, beautiful mid-fall, fall morning with the sun. And I looked down on the Statue of Liberty, as millions and millions of people not from the United States have done before, and just as my ancestors did. And I was reminded that I was headed for the Bronx. There are 1.4 million residents of the Bronx. And you, Lehman College family, you are the only post-secondary public upper division bachelor's and graduate degree granting institution in the borough of the Bronx. What an extraordinary opportunity. Virtually unparalleled, I think, in the United States. I've heard two words that immediately suggest alliteration in describing by many of your colleagues that I've interacted with before this visit about the work that you're going to hear described this morning. Two P's. The first is partnership. Partnership between academic administrators, faculty, students affairs officers, instructional technology experts, enrollment management colleagues. It has been repeatedly stressed to me that the progress you've made on the issue I'm here to talk about, transfer, is a result of those partnerships. No one unit is primarily responsible. This is very significant. The second word is passion. I've lost track of the number of individuals involved in those distinct efforts that have used that noun to describe to me what they have for this work. So I want to offer you a hope. And my hope is that you will stay focused on what you're going to hear today. You will not immediately flit to the next big idea. You will stay focused and do what you need to do to sustain and bring these initiatives to full maturity. In that regard, I'm calling for a kind of stability. I view stability as the handmaiden to innovation. And one of the things your students need during the pandemic more than ever is a sense of stability and predictability and warmth. and embrace, professionally speaking, in this environment. So I'm going to look forward to hearing what you will do subsequent to this event. And I'm going to be, I'm not going to restrain myself from offering you some suggestions about some of the things I think you could do to take this even further. Now, I started on this particular slide to say that it's all a luck in the draw in New York City, what happens to you. And I know that better than many because I was born in New York City. But my birth was literally an accident. I am not a planned former child. As I've recently learned, and many of you probably don't know this, but it was just in 2019 that the New York State Legislature and the governor, authorized a change in your state policy about whether or not New York City and the state could release information on pre-adoption parents to adopted people. Prior to that, it was prohibited. So I had lived for a number of decades without knowing who my biological parents were. But now I know, and I know because that law was changed. It's very interesting. On the birth certificates in that era, there's a stipulated item that you have to report. It's only applicable to the female who gave birth, and that was her location in the 3 months prior to the birth. In my case, I can only deduce that my biological mother was in a home for unwed mothers on 42nd Street in Manhattan. Think of a high rent district. You wouldn't find that there now. I've learned that she was 15 and her partner was 17. And he had just gone into the United States Navy. There was something going on then, as you all recall, called World War II. They put me up for adoption. The luck of the draw, the luck of the draw. It's the luck of the draw for every one of your students. Unlike the majority of your students, I was born into what would have been poverty, but I was adopted into privilege, significant privilege, through no agency of my own. And it's taken the next 5 decades in my career for me to unlearn and act on what I've unlearned, namely a number of the prejudices that came with that privilege. My father was an Ivy League, my adopted father was an Ivy League college graduate. So he wanted me to do that. And I was what we call a counter-dependent adolescent, meaning I wanted to do just the opposite of what my parents wanted me to do. So I didn't go to an Ivy League college. I wanted to go to a college way away from where I'd grown up in Connecticut. And I went to a little Ohio town where the oldest college in Ohio was found. It looks like a New England village because it was settled by settlers from Massachusetts and Connecticut in the 1780s. So I was lucky. I went to college. Okay, I didn't pay a cent for my own education. I didn't work while I was in college, except in the summers. I lived on a campus in residence halls. I had a very traditional college education. I'll talk about that later. Okay, now if you're even luckier in the Bronx, you get to come to Lehman College. But not enough people yet get to come here. So one of your unfinished agendas is to increase the number of Bronx residents and beyond that you serve. Now, the provost mentioned that I have been here before, and this slide talks about that. I came here with my wife, Betsy Barefoot, as part of a national research project in 2002. I don't know if any of you remember this or not, but Lehman was nominated by the provost at that time for a national review and competition for institutions that were to be selected by a blind review panel and noted and recognized nationally as, quote, an institution of excellence in the first college year. We set out to select 12, but when 2 of the 4 United States military service academies nominated themselves, we changed the number to 13. So we selected 13 institutions, and you were one of them. And in this book, I wonder if anybody still has a copy of this anywhere on the campus. I'm going to send the provost a copy. I think I maybe already have sent you a copy of the chapter in here on Lehman College. My wife and I came and spent 2 days, and we interviewed scores of people, including a significant number of students, about the Lehman experience. And I have several very powerful memories of that. One is spending time in a faculty office observing Professor Stephen Wyckoff, who was in effect leading what were the Lehman versions of the troops he led in Vietnam through the dangerous challenges of higher education to help them be successful at Lehman. Very powerful for me to observe. I also observed a remarkable cohort of primarily adjunct faculty that were teaching in a learning community model for all first-year students. And my wife and I spent a lot of time with those students learning about what they were gathering and gaining from that experience. This is 20 years ago, and I remember it as if it was yesterday. And I can't help but wondering if Betsy and I were to come back and interview people involved in the first year here, what would they tell us? Would Lehman still be as meritorious to be designated as an institution of excellence in the first college year? What I'd rather see even more is a national case study selection process, which I'm going to commit to inaugurate, to recognize institutions for excellence with the transfer phenomenon. I'm going to talk a bit about that. But the question is, what did you do then? What are you doing now? How much of that survived? Some of you might want to go back and look at that, I think, excellent case. So I want to offer you what I'm going to call some framing ideas, the ideas that underlie everything else I'm going to tell you. And I believe that I have in common with you educators that have honored us by joining us this morning, that all of you have framing underlying assumptions. And I'd like you to feel free to share some of them in the chat. And another thing I'd like to say is that all this context for what you do with transfer has to be connected to two systems that are struggling to create an actual system for transfer. And the two systems, of course, are the City University of New York, the largest public university system, urban university system in the United States, and Lehman College. Now, you, ladies and gentlemen, you have more control over the Lehman system than the CUNY system, but you can and you are influencing the CUNY system, for example, through your leadership of the BTAG Alliance. That's influencing the rest of the system. So it all comes down to what in the social sciences we call one's locus of control, or your sphere of interest. What is it that you do for Lehman that you have influence over, that you don't have to ask others for permission to do, that you've already got it? So what I'd like you to do, if you would, is to just enter a comment, if you wish, in the chat, and then you can follow what you're all entering there. What's your sphere of control? What do you influence? Okay. Now, one of my assumptions is that because of the high rate of change that we're all experiencing right now, we have to accept that as inevitable, but we have to try to manage it. And if we don't take responsibility for change, others will. And so the question is, how might we want to do that? And in your case here at Lehman, just as in my case in my work, we have more freedom to initiate change and to determine our own circumstances than just about any work environment I can think of. We have that freedom because we have academic freedom. Some of us have tenure. A significant number of us have served at Lehman for decades. We have a great deal of professional autonomy. Now, one of the things that happened to me in college got me thinking about this freedom. And I wonder how you get your students thinking about their freedom and the choices they're making with freedom. In my first semester in college, I was not doing well. I cut a lot of classes. I was failing the one course that is the professional preparation I have for what I'm doing right now, which is Public Speaking 101, Speech 101. And my professor asked me near the end of the course if I would like to get a D for the course. I said, yes, sir, absolutely, because I knew it would be a gift because I was failing. And he said, all right, I'm going to give you 2 books to read he didn't use this phrase, but it's an age-old pedagogy. It's called reading as punishment. Okay. And he said, I want you to read these two books and I'm going to give you an oral examination. And you better have read every word, Mr. Gardner. I said, yes, sir. So one of the two books, I could tell you about the other one too, but one of them was a book that became again a bestseller after the election of former New Yorker Donald Trump. And that book was Escape from Freedom by Erich Fromm. And it's written by a Holocaust survivor who fled Germany and was profoundly concerned about what happens in democracies when they gradually shift to authoritarianism and give up their freedom. So the question was, what are you doing with your freedom? That was the question my professor wanted to ask me, wanted me to ask myself. So I want to kind of lay that out here this morning. With the freedom you're given at Lehman College, what are the freedoms that you have to influence student success, and in particular, transfer student success? And Alina is going to share with us several responses.
Thank you, Dr. Gardner. And we have quite a few responses in the chat. So I see the answer to the question, what freedom do you have to influence student success? We have curriculum, working individually with students to support them, working on curriculum, my classes, my department, the college, mentorship, study skills development, considerable freedom to guide and orient new and continuing transfer interested in my fields. I have the freedom to influence departmental curriculum, gen ed, and college curriculum to some degree, certain courses, my students. Planning for degree completion and goal setting. Planning for career development for career success. Curriculum advising, mentorship, teaching. And designing support services and programs for students.
Okay, so those are significant examples of freedom. I want to cite some of the things I've read about, heard about you're doing, your freedom. You helped create the BTAG Alliance. That wasn't there before. You didn't have to do that. You voluntarily chose to do it. You, along with the Borough of Manhattan Community College, where I've also visited, you created the CUNY Advising Train. Really creative. You have developed, you're initiating with the support from the Teagle Foundation, an initiative in general education called Atlas to think about how you use empowering texts to welcome transfer students to Lehman University. You've embarked on a very ambitious course redesign initiative, something I'm particularly interested in, and I'll talk about that in a minute. A redesign that I think is necessary, but I don't think it's yet sufficient. I think you've laid the foundation. You can take that even further. You've also developed a greatly needed system for evaluation of transfer credits. When I visited here the second time, and I'll tell you about that in a minute, in 2010, 2011, all students when they entered Lehman had to, when they transferred, they had to visit individual faculty to have their transcript reviewed, and course credit was determined on the basis of individual course determination at the control of the faculty. This was an enormously inefficient, time-consuming process that discouraged many of your students. I remember talking to them, and it was frustrating for the faculty as well. So you already made some choices about what you're doing with your freedom. I'm wondering if you, wondering not if, but what else you are going to choose to do. Okay, another framing assumption, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to borrow from an important scholar, Alexander Aston. Very simple model. It's called the IEO model. And it said the O stands for outcomes. And in this case, you want to improve your outcomes for transfer students. You want to be able to accept more of them, support more of them, and to support them through to receipt of a credential or a degree. That's your outcome. And to do that, you got two ways to do it. You can either change the input, that is, who comes to Lehman. You could, and you are attempting to recruit more honor students. That will change your outcomes, but there are not enough of them, and everybody else wants them. So your key strategy has to look at a much broader cohort of students. And that gets us to the E. The E is the environment. So if you want to improve your outcomes, your greatest potential to improve your outcomes is to improve the environment, and you control your environment. You control Lehman College. So what is that E that you're introducing transfer students? Well, it's as they find the college when they arrive. Do they arrive at a college that immediately recognizes them and celebrate them? Should I have seen when I walked on the campus this morning a statue for the unknown transfer student? Should I have seen in this building anything that is welcoming transfer students? What's the E here for new students? Well, the E most dominantly are the common experiences, what the greatest number of them are likely to experience. And one of those is commuting. There's another CUNY initiative, which you all know about, that has attempted to ease the challenge of commuting to CUNY campuses. The city is a huge environmental factor. One of your colleges has actually created a course for new students where they study the city. Do you have a course for your students where your students study the relationship between the Bronx and being a successful resident here and contributing to this city as a college graduate? They all experience registration, overwhelmingly most of them financial aid, and academic advising. Those are parts of the E. Food service. They experience the CUNY culture, whatever that means, and something they all experience, which is the single greatest kind of capture point where your students are literally prisoners. They all have to do what are called gateway courses. I'll come back to those in a minute. And they all experience faculty, and they all experience their peers, okay? So these are major areas where you could focus and reach the largest number of students. Now, what else would you argue, suggest, is a powerful component of the Lehman environment, the Lehman culture? Would you enter that, your thoughts on that, please, in the chat? And Lena will monitor that to us. And while you're doing that, I'm going to continue. Some of you may know this, but probably most of you don't. I'm the founder of something in American higher education known as the first year experience. This is a multifaceted set of efforts to improve the success of new college students. And I want to argue here now that the real first year experience, the thing that the most students have the most in common, is the gateway courses. And your first year students take these courses, but so do many of your transfer students, because many of your transfer students are not given credit for such courses that they should have or could have taken previously, or they did take those courses previously, but you're still not granting them credit. So transfer students still take gateway courses. And the research that I and my colleagues in my organization have done have found there is significant transfer student lack of success in gateway courses. Now, your IR office has collected an enormous amount of data, but what I don't know whether they've collected or not, and I would urge them to do so if they haven't, and to share this publicly with you. Now, I think this is the most profound data question I know, and it is what happens to students who take a gateway course and they get a grade of DWFI, and I know you know that because you've been collecting data on your DWFI rates, but what I don't know whether you know is how many of the students who got a DWFI voluntarily left Lehman College. That's what we call voluntary attrition. The majority of student departure, ladies and gentlemen, is not enforced by the institutions. We're not suspending or expelling most of the students who do not return to us. They're leaving us voluntarily. And the best predictor that I have found as to who's going to leave us voluntarily is the receipt of a DWFI. So you need to know what courses, especially focus on the remarks this morning, transfer students, which of your transfer students are taking which gateway courses in which they receive the highest proportion of DWFI grades, and then voluntarily leave you. At the same time, a parallel assumption of mine is that the role of faculty, and hence the need for faculty development, faculty support, faculty rewards for redesign of courses. And I don't mean just redesign of pedagogy. I mean redesign of every component of this course. My organization works with colleges and universities. We give them a set of 50-some questions, performance indicators to guide faculty through a redesign. And we ask students to complete an assessment that was developed by a prominent sociologist called the Student Assessment of Learning Gains. And it's an instrument that asks students for feedback on the structural design of a course. What did my professor make me do? And how much did I learn from that? Which components of the course did I value more than others? This is one form of evidence, okay? So I want to bring up faculty because we started rethinking the design of American undergraduate education in 1965, 1 year after the Civil Rights Act, with the adoption of the so-called Higher Education Act, which Congress periodically reauthorizes. And what we did largely was we created a whole new profession of student affairs professionals and academic administrators of the variety we never had before. And primarily we asked them to be responsible for student success. And we, both intentionally and unintentionally, we, that is those of us that run the academy, we have neglected the faculty role in student success. You are not doing that. And that's one of the things that really encourages me about the future of Lehman. Now, another thing you could do, and I'm going to illustrate this in a few minutes, is that you could identify the rules that make students do what you make them do here. And we know, I call this a policy audit. I'm going to give you some example of rules because when you got to get students doing the things they most need to do. And often you leave to their discretion the things they most need to do, and you don't make them do those things. The majority of colleges and universities, for example, do not require continuing students to participate in academic advising. They just let them register. That is a recipe for academic suicide, okay? So what are the rules you have for students? How many of these rules came from Lehman? How many of them came from CUNY? If you were to do an audit, I would predict very comfortably that the majority of your rules you folks created, but you rarely ever go back and re-examine. Now, another thing that's part of this environment is what we call a barrier. There are two guys at Columbia University Teachers College and the Columbia University Community College Research Center, Davis Jenkins and John Fink, who've done they wrote a piece for me on this, and it's one word. It's the concept of barrier. Barrier. And the idea is you do an audit to examine what are the barriers at Lehman to student progression as transfer students. Now, barriers can be policies, they can be offices, they can be individuals. These barriers are particularly those that have authority on a discretionary basis to say yes or no. Yes, you can do this. No, you can't. Yes, you'll get credit. No, you won't. So if you could just push that notion a bit, and would you enter into the chat an example of a barrier? And I'm asking you to do this because the more you think about transfer students here, you want to think about the barriers that you're creating that you could control and modify. And I'm reading Alina's nonverbals, and I think she has some things to share.
Thank you, Dr. Gardner. So in terms of the earlier question, how would you describe the Lehman experience? We have some responses there saying engagement, encouragement, ongoing support, LEH courses, beautiful campus, many caring faculty who believe in Lehman's mission, juggling the school work-life balance that allows for success in all areas, welcoming, caring people, inclusive. And in terms of the question about the barrier created with Lehman, not CUNY, some of the answers that are coming in, challenging, many offices and forms to deal with, transactional, how difficult it is for students to get in touch with offices, especially during the pandemic. Barriers include students having to go from office to office to get anything done, creates a lot of confusion. Transfer credit evaluation, finding out which office addresses a specific student issue. Students need a central place to transfer in, financial aid. Thank
you. All right, you mentioned work life. Let me just cite one important piece of research of many, and that is that one thing we know, many things we know about students that are more likely to graduate from college, finish a degree, are whether they've worked or not worked. And believe me, in the overall American higher education, students are more likely to graduate from college if they've worked at something while they're in college. So the question is not whether they're working, it's a question of where they're working and how much they're working. And one thing we know in particular is that students who have any kind of on-campus employment, on-campus duties, are more likely to graduate from college. So one of the things I wonder is, how do you use your capacity to employ temporary part-time workers, including and especially students, and how much does that apply to transfer students? Or do your first-year students, because they get here first, they will have been here longer, do they get a disproportionate share of the on-campus jobs? That's worthy of pursuit. Now, a couple of other guiding assumptions here are that there's been a huge amount of research on what are the environmental factors of any college that have the greatest influence on what college students do. And hands down, the greatest influence on what happens to college students is the influence of other students. So I'm wondering, with your transfer students, how do you organize things so that students influence those students? Who influences your transfer students? How do you're an example of a kind of upside down higher education institution in that you have far more transfer students than you have beginning students. The traditional model of American higher education is you take in large numbers of students that you know you're not going to keep, and you even attempt to get rid of them. You winnow them out, and you have a smaller number of majors. You have the kind of environment here that many faculty around the country would love to have, namely more majors than you have beginning college students. So do you need here to have your first year or former first year students who've been here longer and who chose to stay and who are enthused about Lehman, should they be in some way participating in the orientation of transfer students? Are you using your really successful senior transfer students to mentor and partner with these entering transfer students? One of the 13 cases that we selected of institutions that were nominated for this award was another institution from New York, namely Mr. Jefferson, President Jefferson's second university after the University of Virginia, the United States Military Academy at West Point. And one of the most significant components of the West Point experience is that every student there, upon entry, is assigned another student as a mentor. And the thing that West Point does that's so unique is that the basic question that's being taught here is responsibility. And if the student who's being mentored acts in an irresponsible manner or underperforms, who does West Point hold responsible? The older student, the mentor. The mentor is called on the carpet, okay? Because his or her job was to ensure that the mentee was acting responsibly. There's huge literature on the power of mentoring. So I want to, we know that people who are in human organizations where mentoring is established, there's a structure for it, it's formalized, those students advance further and faster in the organization. So the question then is, how do you mentor your transfer students when they arrive? Okay. Another assumption is that, and I will argue this repeatedly this morning, is that transfer is one of a number of structural elements of American higher education that I'm calling socially unjust. Socially unjust. It's a vestige of a system that was designed for and by people like me. Who am I? I am a recovering former New Yorker. I'm a recovering former New England person. I'm a recovering former Protestant. I'm still white. I'm still male, but it's people like that who designed American higher education. And most other colleges and universities are still influenced by that design. And that means that colleges and universities work very well for some students and not so well for others. And in my judgment, the most conspicuous, grossly obvious example of unjust design is transfer. I'm going to come back to that. All right. Now, to understand the student experience at Lehman, you need to use one word constantly. You need to ask your IR staff to do the following. The student experience here, your story, every institution has a story. The Lehman College story is told by your data. And it's not just aggregate data, it's disaggregated data. You must get at the disaggregated data in every element of the Lehman experience, including and especially these gateway courses. Who is receiving these DWFI grades? And how does that correlate with race, gender, first generation status, veteran status, part-time, full-time, et cetera? That tells the story. Now, the story is not static. It's not something that was handed to you. Your story is something that you're writing all the time. And that's what this is about. It's about deciding what's fundamental to the Lehman story that you want to retain, such as what were the values that Mr. Lehman stood for, and how do they get introduced to your students today? I wonder about that a lot. How are you inculcating the Lehman legacy, for better or worse, with your new students? Okay, so underlying all of this is the fundamental question: what can you do within your sphere of influence in writing the Lehman story? That is, without losing your job or incurring significant negative consequences, which would be very hard for you to do because of the freedom here. There's a couple of other related questions, and I didn't think about these when I created this PowerPoint, but I've been thinking about it for the past 48 hours. And the more I've read about you and thought about you, any speaker, as he or she gets nearer to an event, things sort of crystallize. I think you need to really focus on what does it mean to be a predominantly transfer institution, okay? One thing it means, grossly obvious, is that you're very different from institutions that are not predominantly transfer. Is this something you are? Yes, unquestionably. Is this something you want to be? I'm not sure at all, but it is what you are. And the dynamics of the Bronx suggest to me that, well, I don't know what would happen to transform that, what would need to happen. But anyway, so what does it mean to be a transfer institution? And to be a transfer institution unintentionally or intentionally? Usually, the more intentional organizations are about their mission, the more successful they are. Now, speaking of mission, I have read your mission. You are accredited by Middle States. Middle States requires that you have a mission. They evaluate you every 10 years to see to what extent you're performing vis-a-vis your mission. You do not reference transfer students anywhere in your mission. Okay? You have a vision statement. You have a statement of strategic values. Transfer students are not mentioned anywhere in those other two statements. And you have a strategic plan. The word transfer appears once in the strategic plan. Okay? The story is dynamic. It's being written all the time. You write the story. All right, so would you enter into a chat, please? Not the chat. A phrase or a word that best describes the Lehman transfer experience. How do you view transfer here? Maybe you want to respond to this by, how do you think students view it? What's the transfer experience? There's no right answer here. This is highly subjective. It's a matter of perception. And Lena, I'm going to let you fill the chat with that. And I'm just going to go on and repeat what I've already said, is that I don't know what you think. We'll know that in a minute. But I think transfer is an example of unjust design. And I want to raise with you a fundamental personal question for each of you with respect to transfer, namely your own transfer experience. Did you have any? I didn't. I went to one institution. I stayed there. I got a degree in 4 years. therefore I could conclude, or you could conclude about me, that I have no empathy for what it means to be a transfer student. I would dispute that, but so what do you have to do to have empathy for transfer students? Lena, you ready to give us some feedback on the how people perceive the transfer experience?
Yeah, so some of the words that are coming in to describe transfer experience: challenging, confusing, overwhelming, chaotic, and hard to get classes where students transfer last minutes. A comment that we need to do more work with high schools and communities of interest. Intimidating, in particular for first generation college students. Quote, figure it out on your own, end quote. Frustrating, not clear on the process. And we also have the poll up on all of the screens for those of you who are participating remotely, and for those of you who are here in person and join the online session. There's a poll there asking to respond: in my own undergraduate experience, I was a transfer student, or I was never a transfer student. And we see those responses coming in.
And we want to see that you'll display those on the screen, right, when they come in. I want everybody to know how many of you who work for Lehman College were a transfer student. While you're entering that, of course, I've confessed that I was not a transfer student. I want to tell you that I've had a lot of experience since then with transfer students. In 1972, I joined a faculty committee to design the first degree at my university that was created for transfer students. And this is something now that's found at hundreds of universities. It's what we call a Bachelor of Arts in Interdisciplinary Studies. It's a bachelor's degree that is designed to take all credits from a transferring two-year institution and apply all of them to a bachelor's degree, with the additional requirements of only 30 hours at the upper division and a minimum of a C average and an approved program of study by 2 faculty advisors. It's many institutions have created these degrees to be more transfer friendly. In addition, I had Provost Malasu's role for 5 of the regional campuses of the University of South Carolina for 13 years. And as provost for those campuses, I was dealing constantly with transfer. And I found the greatest source of transfer challenge was prejudice on the part of administrators and faculty at receiving institutions towards those that have been taught at the 2-year institutions. And I visited here in terms of experience in 2010-11, haven't told you about that, but Lehman was one of 70 institutions, along with the other 3 post-secondary public institutions in the Bronx. Lehman was joined by Bronx Community College and Hostos Community College in a national project called Foundations of Excellence in the Transfer Experience. And you folks produced 80 pages worth of reports and recommendations. And I have promised to send these to the provost so you could have an analysis of what you said 10 years ago you wanted to do and you intended to do. And this was designed to create an improved vision for transfer. There's 70-some institutions, you're one of them, that have done this. And one other type of experience I'll bring up in a minute. But anyway, so what do we got there? What was the percent that were transfer students?
So we have 66% of the respondents noting that never been a transfer student, and 34% saying I was a transfer student.
Well, actually that's higher than I might have thought. That suggests that, if there was some way we could drill down, I suspect that 34% are younger than the 60-some percent. That may not be the case, but now, ladies and gentlemen, the normative experience is in American higher education. The majority of undergraduates are transfer students. Okay, so but that's significant that at least you have a third of your faculty and staff who could really empathize with what it's like to be a transfer student. Okay, so let me get rid of that. And now let me ask you, what percent do you think of current undergraduates at Lehman are transfer students? I'm giving you some ranges there. which grouping, 25, 30, 30, 40, 40, 50, 50, 60, 60, 70, 70, 80, over 80%. What do you think? I read in your, one of your IR fact book pages, what I was told was the percent, but I've since learned from the provost that that has been revised. But anyway, what do you think? They come in, you ready? Okay.
Yeah, so the responses are coming in, and it seems that the overwhelming number is leaning towards 60 to 70% answer, and we have about almost 50% of the respondents noting that.
Okay, I'm encouraged by that because that is the correct answer. All right. And I'm encouraged because that says there is significant, there's a critical mass of you who actually recognize this striking characteristic about your student population. Okay, that's very significant. When I visited here in 2011, the percent of transfer students, I recall, was exactly 69%. Okay. All right. So another related question I wanted to ask you is, I need to advance this, excuse me. If I could have the next slide, please. How many of you are in some position where you have direct relevance, contact with, impact on the success of transfer students? This is what I learned in Speech 101. It's called audience analysis. Or you're in a position that does not have direct contact or influence on transfer. Alina?
So we have almost 85% noting they have direct relevance to transfer student success.
Okay. So we drew to this then an audience that has experience and interest, and we would assume motivation. That's very helpful. Let's go to the next question, which is, this is one I would also suggest you, that you would ask your students. How transfer friendly would you say the college is? You think you're exceptionally friendly, moderately friendly, somewhat unfriendly, very unfriendly? What do you think? We should have said earlier that your responses to this survey are confidential. We cannot trace you. Alina?
So we have about 50% noting moderately friendly, and then it's a split, actually about 30% noting friendly and about 18% noting somewhat unfriendly.
18% were somewhat unfriendly.
17 now.
17? Okay, and what was the third one you mentioned?
Friendly is about 28% right now.
Okay. So if we add the friendly and moderately friendly, we're at 78%. Okay. Well, that's pretty positive, my judgment. But what would it take to get to be exceptionally friendly? And what would we have to do to reduce the perception that you're somewhat unfriendly? Those could be guiding questions. What if you adapted this for a survey with students and you asked them this question or some modification, but then you ask them in open-ended comments to explain why they made the choice that they did? Okay, now the extent to which it's friendly or not friendly is this concept of barriers that we referenced earlier, and some of you entered barriers into the chat. I'd like you to look at this and think about barriers. These are barriers, we gotta know where they come from. Are they primarily created by the college? Are they primarily created by CUNY? Are the barriers to transfer success, are they the responsibility of your sending institutions, the two community colleges in the Bronx? And the borough of Manhattan and Gutman? Is that where the responsibility primarily lies? Or is it really more about the students and what they're doing or not doing? And I'm asking you to pick what you think is most responsible. You know, it could be a combination of these, I acknowledge that, but what do you think is most responsible? Lena?
So far, it's a split between primarily created by the college, which is at 45%, and then primarily created by CUNY, now at 37%.
Okay. Well, the ones that are particularly important is nearly half of you think the barriers are created by the college. Those are going to be the ones that are most amenable to more immediate adjustment. It'd be great if you could complete this in some more detailed fashion and get people to identify what these barriers are so that we could focus on those. All right, now let me see. I think I had one more question here, or did I? Okay, yeah, I was just sharing with you, how did I get empathy for transfer students? One of the things that I wanted to mention is this. This is a book that I spent 3 years working on with 2 other colleagues, and we drew for this. This is a book called, let me advance the slide here. Oh my goodness, it's not advancing. Well, I'll read it off while my Migdio solves my slide problem here. This is called The Transfer Experience, a handbook for creating a more equitable and successful post-secondary system. This was published in February of this year. It was based on a study we did with a 9-month planning grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We convened some 53 experts to help us do this. And we're going to do another edition of this. We have in here a dozen case studies of high-performing transfer students. Lehman was not in there. That's too bad. I wish I had known about Lehman what I now know. We're going to repeat this. But as an exercise, what would you need to do to be written up as a case study on a high-performing transfer institution? I'll tell you the two institutions that generally are mentioned the most often as the highest performing transfer institutions. And I think you belong in the same club. And you're in a city that is even more notable than the other two that I'm about to mention. One is Arizona State University, the largest public university in the United States, that some believe by the end of this decade will have 300,000 students, okay? The way they have grown is through transfer. Transfer is the key to growth. It's also the key feeder to your graduate programs. Mr. Provost, do I need to repeat that? Yes. Transfer is a key feeder of these most productive institutions to growth of graduate programs. The other is the University of Central Florida. If any of you get the book, by the way, I do not earn any royalties from this book, so I'm free to say that. Okay, I asked here, I reported that nationally, 80% of two-year students declare upon entry that their ultimate intention is to transfer. That's what the CUNY data suggests as well. But nationally, only about 15% accomplish that goal within 6 years. At Lehman, I've learned just this week, it's at 17%, so you're slightly better. But should you be satisfied with 17%? I don't think so. I want to go on here. I got to give you I got to ask you to rethink how you define transfer. I'm sorry, I'm not, yeah. I want to ask you to rethink the conventional definition of transfer, which is that transfer is a stage of development. It's a transition. It's a limited period, a limited time frame, that it's simply a transactional analysis of application, review of credits, that it's some kind of event. I want to argue instead that it is those things in part, but it's especially, if you're going to do anything about improving transfer student success, you have to view transfer as the sum of everything that transfer students do at the sending institution and the receiving institution. In other words, transfer is the totality of the educational experience. It's not just how they're processed administratively, okay? And that means in America, we produce two kinds of students. We produce transfer students and non-transfer students. And those two types of students are profoundly different. the transfer student has a very different experience than the non-transfer student. This echoes the Supreme Court decision of 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson out of Louisiana, when the Supreme Court establishes the rule of the land that separate railroad cars for Black passengers were permissible as long as they were equal, which of course they never were, and nothing else that followed was. And that's how we got the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, ending separate but equal. In American higher education, we have separate, and I would argue continuing, not equal for transfer students. Now, I want to quickly move this, if I can, to, I was going to ask you, Alina, you can ask them, do they agree with, my definition of transfer? See if they do.
Yes, and actually, it was nearly 90%.
Okay.
Now it's 85% that agree. And a couple of other things that I just wanted to point out in the chat. There's been a fantastic discussion noting that the use of technology and also has really been improving in the recent years, and how we have been addressing the transfer experience with technology, as well as the issue with the ratio of advisors to students and the need for additional resources, and how we have collectively been working to address that issue. There are lots of other comments in the chat, but I just want to point out that we're almost nearly out of time for the session, and we'll try to make adjustments later on with lunch and the break, but noting for everyone to actively participate in the chat. Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to finish up here in a couple of minutes. I want to get these slides advanced here if I can, and I need McDeo to help me advance these slides. Let me ask him if he could advance the slides to the one that says actions for intervention. I don't have the number. Let's see. Sorry to hold you folks up here. Okay, it's coming. It's coming. I have a hypothesis, by the way, that one of the things that's operating in transfers is the exact parallel and play out on American college campuses to what's happening in the labor force. The Wall Street Journal, this morning's edition, front page, an assessment of why people are not going back to work. Why are a number of them not either starting college or going back to college? My argument is because of the hassle, the stress, the nature of those environments, particularly for the less fortunate populations. It can't be a coincidence that we're somehow different from what's affecting people going into the labor market. I need to advance the slide again. Miggy, if you could remove the one that's up there now.
And Dr. Gardner, just for the question that you had at the top, do you agree with the hypothesis may partially explain a factor impinging the college's enrollment? 97% of the respondents said yes.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, they may have thought that originally, but I'll conclude that I was persuasive. Okay, let me conclude this here. And I'm going to give you or make available this entire PowerPoint that lays all this out in some greater detail. But there are things that I think need to be done that would improve the overall state of transfer at any institution. One is making transfer a higher priority. One example of this, very important, your president has stayed for this entire session, okay? I thought he was going to leave. Okay, I didn't know that, but the leadership of any organization, its messaging, the points they stress, everybody listens to them and they say things often enough, people start believing them. So there's a myriad of ways you can make transfer a high priority. That's critical. Secondly, you have to start with the end in mind. What do you do to produce successful college students? There are a number of things you can do to increase transfer student success. A lot of this has to do with how you orient them, how you advise them, and what happens to them in their first courses that they take upon transfer. Another intervention is to make better use of your data, to understand what's happening to your transfer students. That's why you need to disaggregate the data. Another strategy I would suggest or intervention is to have some kind of voluntary self-study. You ought to go back and revisit the study you did in 2010, 2011, and update this. You have to involve more faculty in what happens to transfer students. The provost knows this. He and his colleague they're doing this. They need to carry that forward. That's really important. You need to identify the barriers. I've talked about this. This policy audit, I would recommend you identify all your policies, your financial aid policies, your registration policies, parking, but all the policies and rules you have, and see to what extent you differentiate between transfer students and non-transfer students, and then make adjustments accordingly. Applications for deadline, costs for application, deadlines about notice of acceptance, timeliness of recognition of credit, and how do you manage prior learning experiences. The financial aid deadlines, to what extent are these similar? The eligibility for financial aid. Can you go out and raise money for transfer students that you haven't been able to raise for non-transfer students? Do you have on-campus residence? I couldn't find it. All right, so that's not relevant. Priority for class registration. That has a huge impact on student success. And who is required and not required to participate in various types of elective and special programming. The quality of advising and whether or not it is optional or mandatory. If it's initially mandatory, how long does it remain such? And who does the advising? How well prepared are they? How are they evaluated? How are they reinforced and rewarded for this work? What about eligibility for internships and co-ops to transfer students? How do they fare with that versus your first-time students? What about eligibility for study abroad? Participate in national student exchange? On-campus employment that I mentioned earlier. Do you have any special awards or prizes for transfer students? Do you recognize transfer students in award ceremonies or in any other ceremonial occasions? Do you have any special rituals that pay attention to transfer students and their families, particularly upon entry? What kind of specific offices and programs do you have dedicated to transfer student support? I recommend you audit your website and all those categories of your website and look at the distinction between how they talk about the transfer experience versus the non-transfer. Those are big clues on how much attention you pay to transfer students. Peer-to-peer relationships, these kinds of officers, you already have a lot of this going on. There may be some, I would say of all of these, the most important peers to get together are faculty at Lehman with faculty from your two primary community college, CUNY, sending campuses to talk about the relationships between their courses. Do you have a stakeholder advisory group? I think you have a number of groups, but do you have a kind of most official stakeholder group for this topic? We've talked about asking your students how transfer friendly they are. Do you have anywhere where you record the history of transfer students? You recognize them in any publications? You have photographs of them? One of the institution that claims it sends more Black Americans to medical school than any other college in the country is Xavier University of New Orleans, where you go in the buildings there and the walls are just plastered with photographs of students, okay, noting what they've done. And so how are you recognizing your transfer students? Okay. And I don't know whether you folks participate in the New York State Transfer and Articulation Association. That would be good. There are other professional activities that you could be involved in. I think I need to yield my time. I didn't do everything I planned to do, but the main thing is to listen now to your colleagues, what they are doing to support transfer. And we are going to reconvene at well, again, in this plenary setting at the end of the day for some small group discussions. We're going to be asking you, what ideas are you getting? What have you learned today? What do you feel good about? What are you still concerned about? And especially, what do you want to see the college do going forward? I really appreciate whatever attention you've been able to give me this morning. And I've taken my hour. And thank you very much for this privilege to be at the Lehman College.
We will have time for a few questions from the in-person audience and from online. So we'll have time for 2 or 3 questions, if there are any for Dr. Gardner. Do you have any online questions, Alina?
1 second for folks to type in the chat. If there are any questions, Dr. Gardner will stay at the podium for the next few minutes. So we invite you to enter your questions in the chat, as well as let us know here in the audience. And I see there's a question in the live audience here.
Yes, I do have a question. It's a little bit more of a comment than a question. And that is when we talk about the 60% of students that we have that are transfer students, I think, and I was wondering if there's research across the board on that. If we look at the upper level classes, we have way more than 60% of students that are transfer students, because over 4 years of a college career at Lehman, or 6 years of a college career, in the first year, students are almost 100% non-transfer students. So this changes the entire statistics later on. So at Lehman, I think in the upper level courses and within the majors, we have more closer to 70 or 80% of students that are transfer students. And I was wondering if you know of research and about this and of how other institutions are dealing with that.
I think you've just given us a wonderful example of the power of disaggregated data. I asked you as a plenary audience, what percent of the total student body here, but you're asking, I think, an even more important question than I did. And so, I think that it would be important for academic units at the departmental level where the faculty are to be raising that question and discussing what are the implications of that? How, in what faculty are doing in a junior or senior level course, are they cognizant of who the students are and how the differing experiences that got them into that course influence the dynamics of the course? And that needs to be done by discipline. All right, I think that would be very fertile. In most academic departments, as I say, most institutions have fewer majors than they have the lower division students, and you're just the opposite. And that's a wonderful opportunity. That's a way in which, if I were looking for a job as a faculty member, I would like to teach in a place like that. Well, I would, I've loved teaching beginning students, but I certainly would like to teach at the upper division. So I think that's one you could explore. And, what could you do to structure some of the interactions between transfer and non-transfer students? I would want to know, is there any age difference? Is that playing out? Do the transfer students have more experience in the workforce than the non-transfer students? All of that could influence the dynamics of the course. Okay. So that, if you were to undertake your own Lehman self-study of the dynamics of the transfer experience and what does it mean to be a transfer institution, that's exactly the kind of question you should be asking. Melina?
So we have another question in the chat. How can we best track transfer students into classes that would be best helpful to them? So there's a core transfer offerings would be helpful or act as a bar to transfers enjoyment and success.
I'm not sure I understand the question. You better hit me again with that.
Let me read this again. So how can we best track transfer students into classes that would be best helpful to them, right? So how do we channel them? And then the continuation is there a core transfer offering that would be helpful or maybe act as a bar to transfer enjoyment and success?
Okay. Well, again, that's very complicated, but let's look at this. I suspect you have some data on what are the best predictors for transfer student success here? And how is that a function, number one, of which college they came from? What does your data suggest? And at what point did they transfer? Had they received an associate degree? How many credit hours were they allocated? And then if you analyze the course taking patterns, what do successful ultimate graduates from Lehman, what are the courses they are more likely to have completed before they came? And also, what courses are they having difficulty with at Lehman? Because that's something you control directly. You can also influence what's done at the 2-year feeding sector through the partnership between your faculty at both the junior and senior level institutions. But I think that comes back to a lot of refined data analysis. But I don't want to overemphasize the quantitative data approach. How often do you do any kind of qualitative studies through surveys and, most importantly, focus groups with transfer students to ascertain the nature of their experience here? what's working with them. You know, if you convene your most successful students, I find you want to know what the unsuccessful ones are doing too, but the more you know about what successful transfer students are doing, that's what you have to replicate. Okay, what are the strategies that your students are using? You're one of many institutions that does not have a course designed for first-term transfer students about basically focusing on transfer student success. What would they have to do here? And if you don't have a specific course to do that, in the courses you know that are primarily comprised of first-term transfer students, what are some of the things that the faculty could be doing in those courses that would be more likely to promote student success? The students will tell you. It's their experience. They're living it. And that's where, you know, your partnerships with your student affairs colleagues and your IR folks, your assessment people, all that comes into play. The more you can interact with students and ask them what is the nature of their experience. Students love to tell others what they're doing in college. They like the fact that anybody cares enough to ask them and convene them. So you got to have a balance of qualitative and quantitative approaches to understanding this population. This is your population. This is your largest population. This is what you specialize in, even though you have not yet, I think, officially declared your intention to specialize in this population, but that's what you're doing. That it? Okay, thank you very much.